To the first ever episode of the Conn Smythe Chronicles. What are the Conn Smythe Chronicles? Well, basically, super easy. It is a podcast entirely dedicated to the Conn Smythe Corner Fantasy Hockey League, to its content, to its members, and also everything related to the NHL. As for our first episode, I'm having the pleasure to have John with us. John is the general manager of the Toronto Arenas. You guys know John, and you also know that he does a power ranking every year. And we're here to talk about his first power ranking for the 2024-2025 season. John, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks so much, Francis. Honored to be the first ever guest on the Conn Smythe Chronicles. It is a historic moment. Super happy to be here and happy to pump some teams up and knock some teams down maybe a bit in terms of the power rankings. So we'll get into it in a few minutes.
I'm actually looking to that part. Really, I'm actually excited about that part. So listen, let's start by talking a little bit about you and the power ranking. How many years have you been doing the power ranking?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the first season I did it was in 2020. So probably 4 or 5 years now, I think. It's been a while. But yeah, it goes back probably 4 or 5 years.
Okay, so for those who don't know, what are your criteria when you're doing the power ranking? How do you rank the teams? What do you base your ranking on?
So what I'm only looking at is the post-draft roster. I'm not looking at kind of anything to do with the managers necessarily. Like I try and kind of turn a blind eye to the potential for adds and drops and kind of moves down the road or something like that. And I don't usually consider, for example, prospects. Like we don't know, for example, if the Sharks will call it Mitchkov or whatever. So those are things I generally don't look at. I'm just looking at kind of post-draft roster. In terms of how I rank the teams one against the other, it's honestly really hard. It is really tough to come up with kind of a 1 to 16 list. What I tend to value kind of the most is like depth, like a lot of quality players, because most teams will have their first and second round pick every year. Some teams will trade away their third round pick or whatever, and then it kind of goes from there. But most teams will have at least a couple really elite players. But what separates kind of the teams for me is the quality of the depth. At the end of the day, fantasy hockey is you just add up the points of all your guys, right? It's just a sum. So if you have top end guys that are, playing a bit better than the top guys, that gets you something. But if you're getting let down by the guys at the bottom of your roster, and there's 23 guys on a roster, right? So if you're getting let down by the bottom of the roster, that can really sandbag your team. It's a tough process, and that's kind of how I do it.
Yeah, I find that it was my first year for a draft. It's my first year in the fantasy hockey league, and I found that the first 4 or 5 rounds are pretty easy. It's afterwards it gets complicated, like you said, right? It's easy to pick up the elite players, but then afterwards it's kind of like, ooh, okay, where am I going with those 6, 7, 8, and 9 rounders?
Totally. You need to be kind of thinking about, who's going to be available when I'm making my picks, right? Some teams, I think it was maybe QC, there's a few teams this year that had like no picks after round 14. So they're not really looking at the totally deep sleeper guys. Whereas other teams that have a lot of picks in rounds like 18, 19, 20, whatever, need to really focus on kind of the guys that are going to be available at pick like 300 or whatever it is.
Yeah. Definitely.
It kind of affects your strategy for sure.
All right, so let's get into it. Power ranking 2024-2025 on top of the list right now. So far, season hasn't started yet, but so far we have the Philly Phantoms as your number one team for your power ranking. And you said earlier, we were talking about it, and you said it was clear for you that Philly was number one. Why is that?
Philly clear number one for me for again, for kind of the reason I said, which is depth. I'm looking at kind of a large number of really, really quality players. And it starts, of course, with the defense core. Makar and Josie, arguably the two best defensemen, fantasy-wise at least, that are kind of out there. After that, you got Mo Sider, who's just, like a category filler. Like 200 blocks, 200 hits. He'll have a bunch of shots, decent kind of point output as well. So he's an excellent player. Peter Angelo's no slouch, even though he's kind of fading his career a bit. He's always,
Mm-hmm.
racked up the block shots, which are pretty valuable in our format. And then I go and look at the forwards, and you kind of think, well, okay, they spent their first two picks on defensemen, but you take a step back and look at the forward group, and it's actually pretty decent. Like no kind of elite top of the line guys here, but I'm looking at a wing group of Kyle Connor, Kempe, Stamkos, all guys that could score 30, even 40 goals. Nugent Hopkins, Giroux, Nakis, very good players. Bunting, Hall kind of might, find themselves in a good situation, power play time, depending on kind of what happens there. And then at center, Robert Thomas, Kadri, kind of reliable producers. Kadri in particular, I actually really like this year. I don't think Calgary is going to be a very good team, but
Mm-hmm.
Kadri's always put up a bunch of points. And then the goalies as well. Like goalies, our league weights wins pretty highly.
Mm-hmm.
And Georgiev, Anderson, and Hill are all on teams that should be certainly in the top half, if not kind of the top, let's say between like the 12th and the fifth-ish best team in the league, racking up a bunch of wins. So you add it all up, and it was hard to compete with that for me.
All right. Well, we'll see how Philly is going to do, in the next few weeks. And then afterwards, we were talking about it a bit earlier as well. You were talking about in between rank 2 and 9, and then you said that anybody could have been at any rank in these orders. Basically, that's the number 9 team could have been the number 9 team could have been second, and then the second one could have been ninth. So everything is pretty close and tight in between the number 2 and number 9 rank.
Yeah, it was. Maybe I wouldn't say like, oh, I could have put 9 at 2, but it's certainly really,
Okay.
really close. Like it's like a lot harder to kind of separate the teams out, and it kind of just comes down to personal preference.
Mm-hmm.
At a certain point, I really liked honestly a lot of the drafts. Like putting the Thrashers down at 8 there was tough. I felt like they have a pretty good team, but there's just kind of I tried to articulate a bit in the power rankings, kind of in the write up there, but all those teams I think are really good, and even the next handful of teams that come after that, like there's a lot of good teams this year. It was tough to separate them out, and at a certain point, you just have to make a judgment call, and you got to come up with 2 to kind of 16 ranking there.
Yeah. And, when we're looking at the power ranking, the Toronto Arenas, your team, is number 4. What do you have to say to the CSC members who, behind your back are calling you a cocksucker and a sellout to put your team on number 4 spot?
Not surprised that people are calling me a cocksucker. That's total typical behavior of some of the general managers in this league. Wouldn't expect any kind of upstanding behavior from some of these GMs, but what are you going to do? But of course, I like my team because I drafted it, right? Like a lot of these guys are guys that I valued kind of higher than other guys might have it, and it comes down to my kind of own subjectivity. And if you don't like it, then make your own power rankings, and no one's going to read them. So because I'm doing the power rankings, so that's what I have to say to those guys. But again, like I could have. I'm kind of in that mix with a ton of teams there, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot of kind of movement by the time we do the quarter season kind of update after 4 or 5 weeks.
Great. And anyway, message to the other managers who are going to be on that show. If you're not happy with the power ranking, or you have any messages to send towards John, it's here, it's happening. No more no more in the back messages. All right, let's get serious here and continue our interview, doing obviously the review of the power ranking 2024-2025 with John Lenz. So we also were talking about your favorite picks of the draft, and the first one you listed was Kaprizov, who got selected on the 15th rank. It was on the first round. It was the 15th player selected. You really like that pick. Tell me why.
Yeah, absolutely. Kaprizov's, honestly, I was looking at him. There's a few guys I was considering with the number 7 pick. So I'd pick 7. I picked Mikko Rantanen. There's a handful of guys I had I was looking at there, and Kaprizov was one of them. He's a guy that racks up a ton of block shots, shots on goal. Sorry,
Hmm.
big power play guy, big goal scorer. He had kind of a down season last year, and he was over 90 points. This
Hmm.
guy is excellent. He really turned it on in the second half of the season last year as well. And my hot take there for Providence, who ended up picking him at pick 15, was that he finishes as a top five player, top five skater at least, in the CSC. And to get in there at 15, I thought was just really, really good value.
Nice. And then after that, your second favorite pick of this draft was Shevchnikov, who was drafted by the Maroons in the fifth round. Tell me why.
Yeah, another guy I really like this year. Carolina is always a weird team because they have typically not given their top line players a ton of ice time.
Hmm.
They've always had a pretty deep team and spread out the ice time kind of
Evenly.
more evenly than like a
Yeah.
Colorado who's giving like Rantanen and McKinnon like 22 minutes or whatever.
Hmm.
So that's kind of held Svechnikov back. But I'm wondering if kind of Carolina, who's lost some depth this year, maybe relies more on kind of the top guys. Svechnikov's, has a pedigree. I think he was number 2 overall pick a number of years ago.
Hmm.
Big shots on goal guy, big hits guy. And if, I could see it being like a Philip Forsberg type season where everything just clicks all at once. He's had kind of the potential's always been there, but it just hasn't worked out. And then everything clicks and he's, a top, whatever it is,
Hmm.
20, 25-ish player in the league.
Yeah, I agree. It's actually a really good pick at the fifth round. I was looking to grab him up, but couldn't actually do it. So congrats to the Maroons. That's a really good. That's actually a good pick. I have to say personally, it was my first draft, right? And that's the draft that was the most, not the draft, but that's one of the picks I was the most nervous about because I really wanted to have that player. I thought I was going to be able to have him, and then I needed to decide what I was going to do and turn around. So congrats for the Maroons to fuck with my mind there. Next one, we have Brock Nelson, who got picked up by the Thrashers. That was on the 10th round.
Yeah, so Nelson's a guy who is, first of all, he's on the Islanders. So right away, total snooze fest of a team. No one likes the Islanders. No one's trying to watch the Islanders play.
Hmm.
But you look at this guy's numbers every year, and he's putting up 30 plus goals, 35 goals sometimes.
Hmm.
He's a center only position eligibility, which is maybe a bit less attractive in our format. But he's just one of these guys that kind of keeps falling, and you have him there, and you don't know or whatever. It's not a pick that you're like really excited about.
Hmm.
In some cases, but man, this guy is such a producer. And to get in there in the 10th round, I'd be super happy with that if I was Marco there. So I thought that was a great pick.
And if the Islanders want to have any kind of chance to make it into the playoffs, they will have to rely on Brock Nelson because that team, like you said, it's a bit of a snooze, right? So they need to rely on all their players, but particularly on their stars, if we can call Brock Nelson a star. So yeah, he's definitely a good pick on the 10th round. And last but not least, at the beginning of our Tier D players, Tier D round, on the 14th round, we have Chandler Stevenson that was picked up by the Cougars.
Yeah, so Stevenson is a guy that I have historically not been a huge fan of because he's kind of gotten overdrafted. He isn't the mold of forward that I necessarily go for. I try and generally go for guys with like shots on goal is a stat that I look for. He's been a pretty like kind of efficient player. He relies on like a higher shooting percentage and all that. But to get him all the way down in round, I think 14 it was.
Yes, it was
I
14.
think is a really great pick. Seattle's kind of a weird team. At least under the previous coach, their Hackstall, they were like you talk about Carolina who spread out the ice time. Seattle was like almost like equal ice time almost for kind of all their guys, right? So he signed a big contract over there. Should get a good opportunity to get some minutes. And yeah, just to kind of get that name there in round 14, I thought was some pretty good value.
John, to wrap it up, there were also some teams that could have made better decisions with their draft picks, and one of them is the Flames. Tell me why you think that the Flames could have done better. And actually, you've ranked them sixth in your power ranking. So it's kind of I'm kind of intrigued to hear what you have to say here.
Well, yeah. So first of all, the Flames outsource some of their decision making to Yahoo's brilliant X rank creators.
Hmm.
So the first, I don't remember how many picks it was, but probably 5 or 6 picks were made by our friends over at Yahoo. And it's not like those picks were terrible. Like for example, Panarin in the first round, like totally fine. He's a guy that I like. For example, if Kaprizov was sitting there, I totally would have gone for Kaprizov there, but. Um,
For Panarin,
you
yeah.
know, like whatever. I'm not going to be too kind of disappointed with that. Reinhardt's
Hmm.
a guy who excellent player, but to get him with the first pick of round 2, and you kind of look at the guys who got drafted after him,
Hmm.
probably the next anywhere 5, 6, 7, 8 guys I would have been more interested in than Sam Reinhardt. Kreider with the first pick of round 3, not a guy I'm a huge fan of. Ovechkin, like later in round 3, I don't know. I
Hmm.
don't know. So these are a lot of kind of aging guys. And then you pick the second goalie there, Saros, which is a questionable strategy. So that, like, first of all, I got off to a bad start with the auto draft. And then you kind of look at the next handful of picks are kind of guys that it's hard to see like what the plan was really for building this
Hmm.
team. So I see like rounds 5 and round 6, Doughty and Shabbat. Obviously, they needed defensemen after they kind of the Flames kind of came back online
Hmm.
there. Um, and then there's no more defensemen picked until Slavin in round 9. Again, not a guy I really love, honestly. And then there's a ton of kind of aging vets here towards the bottom of the lineup. So Andrews Lee in round 10. So we talked about Brock Nelson in round 10 a minute ago. Andrews Lee also got picked in later in round 10.
Hmm.
So I think there's a huge kind of gap in terms of value there for Nelson versus Lee. Eberle, Niederreiter, TJ Oshie got picked, and he's already been dropped because he's not
Yeah.
playing this year. Like that was a
Yeah.
round 14 pick. So
Hmm.
a lot of decisions I
Questionable.
would have gone a different way
Yeah.
than the Flames, including the auto draft picks.
All right. And then we have the Toledo Gold Diggers, who had, let me pardon my French, but shitload of draft picks prior to the 12th or even like the 14th round. They were packed on draft picks. I was actually, I remember getting into the league and looking at their draft picks. I was like, damn, he's he's heading to amazing 2024-2025 season, with all these picks, and yet you're placing them on the 12th rank.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, to summarize kind of thing, they only made their last 2 draft picks that they actually made, so not keepers, were in round 15. So all their guys were picked in round 15 or earlier.
Hmm.
But in my view, some of these picks were either kind of risky or just kind of
Questionable.
didn't maximize value here. So like
Okay.
I don't want to kind of slam Toledo too hard, but the Brent Burns thing, I just don't understand. I don't think I would have picked him. I don't even know where I would have picked Brent Burns, but like, I'm seeing like Devin Taves picked in round 6, Darnell Nurse, Justin Falk picked in round 9, like Gudis even round 9. I'm scrolling down here trying to kind of find a spot where I'd
Yeah.
be comfortable taking Burns, and he was a keeper, right? So not only is it do you have to use a 3rd round pick on him, but you forego being able to keep 4 guys if you use a keeper
Hmm.
in that spot, right? So a lot of kind of decisions were made leading up to the draft that I thought were not kind of optimal decisions.
Hmm.
And then when it comes to the actual draft picks, like I don't have a huge issue with any of these. Like Brady Tkachuk, totally excellent player. He's really good in our format. Hyman, I think, is going to produce a ton of goals again. Even Bedard in round 3, maybe a little risky. He wasn't, he put up a lot of points, but actually didn't have a great fantasy season in our
Hmm.
format last year. But rookie kind of player there, and I think McDavid went from like 60 something points to 100 points, so you can totally see a jump
That,
there.
yeah, exactly. Hmm.
But yeah, just overall, not a collection of players that really gets me like excited. I'm seeing Jamie Benn at the top of round 6 when like the next kind of handful of guys here, Scheifele, DeBrincat, Jared McCann, Jones, Kadri, Tuck, Juhu, like all these guys I find kind of more appealing
Hmm.
than Jamie Benn at this stage of his career. So um, maybe it's a personal preference thing, and Toledo will, there's totally a chance that Toledo will prove me wrong. But
Hmm.
when it comes to, yeah, just stacking up the rosters next to each other, then how I value the players, I thought the ranking was appropriate.
All right, John, thank you very much for being here on the first episode ever of the Conn Smythe Chronicles. It was a pleasure to have you aboard. We're actually going to talk soon, after, like you said, after the quarter of the season, you're probably going to do another power ranking. So if you're up for it, you're invited once again to go around your power ranking.
Absolutely happy to be a regular guest here on the show, and we'll talk again soon.
All right, perfect, guys. So thanks a lot for being here and see you soon.